fifth graders. So today we are going to begin rounding decimals to the tenths and hundredths place. You will need your composition notebook, a pencil. If you are able to print our rounding guided practice, you should have that with some glue and scissors. If you aren't able to get this printed, don't panic. I'll show you what your alternative is when we get there. Okay? All right. So make sure you have the supplies that you need. And let's go ahead and get started. Okay. So this is an old journal. So my pages will look a little different, but I was able to get a new table of contents in there. All right. So for, we're going to fill in 2 pages today. So on page 10, we're going to write rounding decimals. Okay. And then on page 11, we are going to have the rounding. This is what I'm going to call GP. We're actually going to put our guided practice today in our notebook so we can look at it and reference it. Okay. Okay. So on page 10, we should have rounding decimals, ROUNDING, and then decimals. On page 11, we should have rounding, and then we're going to put GP, and GP stands for our guided practice. Okay, so find page 10 in your notebook. Mine is not going to look like yours because I'm using a different notebook. Okay, but you should have your ordering decimals over here and be ready to put your notes for rounding decimals right here. And I'm gonna zoom in the only way I know how, which is to readjust this so y'all can see better. Okay, so our title for today is going to be rounding decimals. Rounding decimals. Rounding is ROUNDING. Decimals is DECIMALS. The good news about rounding decimals is this same process for rounding whole numbers. There really isn't anything different, okay? There is one slight change, but it'll be easy to get used to, okay? So we have rounding decimals for our title today, and down at the bottom of the page, I did put my number 10. So make sure you have your page with a title and a number, okay? All right, so let's first start talking about the steps, and then we'll look at the practice part, what it actually looks like. All right, so our steps to rounding decimals. Okay, here we go. First one, we're going to underline, oops, sorry, I shouldn't hold my pencil that far up. Underline the digit. Going to underline the digit in the rounding place. So we're going to underline the digit in the rounding place. That's step 1. So whatever place value it tells you to round to, you're going to underline it. If you round to the tenths place, you underline it. If you're rounding to the nearest hundredths place, you underline the hundredths place. If you're rounding to the nearest whole number, you underline the ones place. Whatever place value they're asking you to round to, you underline. Step 2, okay? We're going to look. Let's do some eyeballs for look. So we remember we need to look, okay? We're going to look at the digit next door. And the direction that we're going next door is we're going to go to the right. So whenever you look next door, we're looking to the right, this direction. You don't look over here, we look over here. Okay? All right. 3. If 5 or more. So if that digit next door is a 5 or higher or more, if it's a 5 or more, we're going to add one more to that place value we're rounding to. We're going to add one more to it. Okay? If that digit next door is 4 or less, if that digit next door is 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. And what that means is that digit is going to stay that same number, no change. Okay, we're going to let it rest. No change to that digit. We don't add one more to it. We keep it the same digit that it already is. Okay? All right. So the last thing that we need to do, especially when we're rounding decimals, is we need to do number 4. Okay? We need to check, that's going to be shorthand for check. We need to check to see if our answer ends in the correct is C-O-R-R-E-C-T, place value. Okay, and I'll explain this as we go through our guided practice. Okay, so again, here are our steps. First one, we're going to underline the digit in the rounding place. 2, look at the digit next door, the one that's to the right. If that digit next door is 5 or higher, we're going to add one more. If that digit is a 4 or less, we're going to let it rest. There's going to be no change. And the last thing we need to do, especially with our decimals, is check to see our answer ends in the correct place value. And I'll show you what I'm talking about. All right, so if you have and we're able to print the guided practice and we're going to get it glued in. If you weren't able to print while we are cutting, the rest of us are cutting this out, I want you, let me back this up. You can turn your page here, okay? And we're going to put this on page 11. So what I want you to do, if you were unable to print this, is I want you to write rounding guided practice at the top. And then I want you to number your paper 1 through 7. And I want you to skip 2 lines between each one so you have plenty of space. So if you didn't get to print it, I'm going to back this up so you can see it. Because you don't have access to a printer. This is what you're doing right now on the next page. I think we have this one here. Let me flip it over and now your page should look like this. You're going to number 1 through 7, skipping 2 lines. But I need to go ahead and get this cut out so we can see what our answers are, what the questions are. Okay. All right. So if you did not get to print this guided practice, you're putting rounding guided practice at the top and you're numbering 1 through 7, skipping 2 lines in between. If you have it printed and you were able to get it printed, we are going to glue it in our notebook. And I just scribbled a whole bunch on there because I'm trying to hurry instead of starting with the line of glue around the perimeter and then through the area. Okay, so let me get mine in there. Let me review one more time before we start going through our guided practice, what your notebook should look like. If you were able to print your rounding guided practice, you have it cut out and glued in your notebook. Okay. If you were not, then you wrote rounding guided practice at the top and you numbered 1 through 7, skipping 2 lines in between. Okay? So if you're not quite ready yet, go ahead and pause and get your paper set up as it should. All right. I'm assuming if this is playing, it's because you're ready. So let's go. Let's start with question number 1 today. Okay? And I'm going to have my steps right here so I don't forget to go through all of them with you. Okay. So number 1 says that it wants you to round 7 and 601 thousandths to the nearest whole number. The first thing we need to think about is, what is a whole number? What's the whole number that we see in 7 and 601 thousandths? Did y'all say 7? Yes, 7 is the ones place. Okay, so if we're rounding to the nearest whole number, we are always rounding to that ones place. Okay, so the whole number will always be that ones place. So I'm going to write it here. Okay, so write down your number, 7 and 601. And the ones place is always going to be our whole number. So step number 1 says to underline the digit that we're rounding to. Okay. And don't be confused by this word nearest. I used it all the way down my paper because I don't want you to get confused by that and think, ooh, the nearest one, so I'm going to go to the tenths. Or does it mean I put a 0 here and I go here? No. When it says the nearest whole number, it means that place value, the ones. Down here, when it says nearest 10, you're going to be underlining the tens place. You're rounding to the tens. So don't let that nearest get you confused, okay? This is the place value we're rounding to, that whole number, which is your ones, okay? So step number 1 is we underline the digit in the rounding place. We're going to look next door, and we're going to draw an arrow to look next door. So we have a 6 next door. The next thing we do is we ask ourselves, and we're only thinking about the 6, and we say, is it 5 or more? And the answer is yes, this is 5 or more. So we're going to add 1 more to this place value that we're rounding to, okay? So this 7 will now round up to an 8, and then the digits behind that rounding place will go to zeros, okay? There's something new though that you need to know with decimals though. This, when you go to look at your answer, it's not going to be 8.000, okay? Because these zeros really don't have a value. I mean, is 8.00 the same thing as 8? Is this worth 8? Yep. Is this worth 8? Yep. If you had $8, wouldn't it still be worth 8? So when we round decimals and we have extra zeros that are behind any digit, they just drop off and our simple answer is 8. So 7 and 601 thousandths just becomes 8. That's our final answer. Okay? All right. So let's go through this again. All right. Round 4 and 321 thousandths to the nearest whole number. Again, the whole number means that we are rounding to the ones place. Okay? It tells you this is the place value to round to the whole number, and that's going to be the ones every time. So we're going to write 4 and 321 thousandths. Step 2 says to underline the place value that you're rounding to. Step 1 is underline the place value you're rounding to. Step 2 is look next door. So we're going to look directly to the right at this number, and it tells us what to do with this one. Let me think. 5, is this 5 or more? Nope. This is 4 or less, so we're going to let it rest. This is just going to stay the same. Okay, this 4 is going to stay the same. So when I write my final number, I'm going to write my 4, and then anything behind this underlined area becomes 0. But remember, when we're rounding in decimals, unlike whole numbers, they just drop off. And so our final answer is 4. Okay. All right, moving on to number 3. We have 34 and 647 thousandths, and we're going to round to the nearest 10. So when you hear that word nearest 10, don't be tripped up by this word nearest. It means we're rounding to the tens place. You are rounding to the 10. You are rounding to the tens place. So we're going to start by writing our number 34 and 647 thousandths. Step 1, underline the place value you're rounding to. We're rounding to the tens place. We underline that place value. The 3 is in the tens place. We look next door to the digit to the right. It tells us what to do. All we have to ask ourselves, we have a digit here. I see that it's a 4. It's 4 or less, so we're not going to make any change to this 3. Okay, so we're going to start by writing a 3, and then all these other place values become zeros. So we have 30. I got to put my decimal point, and I got to put my 0, my 0, and my 0. Okay, but we're not done, because we need to make sure that our answer ends in the correct place value. And this says that you're rounding to the tens. That means we want our answer to end in the tens place. And right now it's got a decimal point and all these extra zeros. Okay, so we fix that just by dropping off those decimal places. And now we have a number that ends in the tens place. And that's what they want us to do. They want us to round to the tens. So remember, those zeros drop off in that decimal zone, and we get the answer of 30. All right, so let's do it again. Number 4, round 68 and 94 hundredths to the tenths place. So we're rounding to the nearest tenth, which basically just means round to the tenths. Okay, that's the place we're rounding to. So we start, we're going to write our number down, 68 and 94 hundredths. We're going to underline the place value rounding to. Nearest tenth means underline the digit that's in the tenths place. The 9 is the digit in the tenths place. We're going to look next door. And this digit here is going to tell us what to do. This digit here, again, this is 4 or less. So we're going to let this 9 stay a 9. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to write everything the same that was before that rounding place. We got to have it there. So we write 6, we write 8, put a decimal. 9 is going to stay the same, and that 4 will become a 0. But remember, this 0 doesn't have a value because 68 and 9 tenths is exactly the same as 68 and 90 hundredths. And since we're rounding to the tenths place, we want our answer to end in the tenths place. And we fix it just by dropping off that 0. And then we can circle that. That will be our final answer, 68 and 9 tenths. Okay. All right. So moving on for number 5, we're going to round 125 and 38 hundredths to the nearest tenths place. Again, the nearest tenths place just means you are rounding to the tenths. It doesn't mean pick one to the left or to the right. That would be confusing. It means round to the tenths place. So we're going to start by writing down our number. 125 and 38 hundredths. We're rounding to the tenths place. Our first step is to underline the digit that's in the tenths place. The 3 is in the tenths place. It's in the first position to the right of the decimal. We're going to look next door. Oh, goody. We finally have a number where we get to do what to it? Well, it's more than 5. It's 5 or more, so we're going to add one more. We're going to add one more to that 3. Okay? So when I start, I'm going to make sure I write these digits down. They have to be included in my answer. These don't change. We were rounding to this position, so this is the one that's going to change. Okay? So I'm going to write 125, and now I've got to that tenths place, and this is where I'm going to make the change. 3 now will become, adding one more, 3 plus 1, that will become 4. And then that 8 just becomes a 0. And then our fourth step is check to make sure that our answer ends in the right place value. What place value should this number end in if we're rounding to the tens place? It should end in the tens place. And so we make it end in the tens place just by dropping off that 0. And our final answer is 125 and 4/10. Okay, so let's do number 6. This one's rounding to the hundredths place. Round 56 and 496 thousandths, to the nearest hundredth. All right. So nearest hundredths means that we're rounding to that hundredths place. That's what it means. That's the place value we're rounding to. It doesn't mean pick the thousands or choose the tenths. Not at all. That would be confusing. You're rounding to the hundredths. Nearest hundredths is the same thing as round to the hundredths place. So we're rounding to the hundredths place. We're going to write our number, 56 and 496 thousandths. We are going to underline the digit that's in the hundredths place. Now the hundredths place is 2 place values to the right of the decimal. So that would be 1, 2. This is the hundredths place. I underline it. Then I'm going to look next door. And this digit here is going to tell me what to do. This digit 6 is 5 or more. So we're going to add 1 more to this place value. Okay? All right. So let's make sure that I noticed something that we need to have a conversation about before we move on. Do y'all notice it? We've got a 9 here, and we're adding a 1 to it. So that means that we are going to make a change over here because we're going to have to move. This will become a 0, right? Because this represents the 10, and then that 10 is going to move over here in this place value. Okay, I'm going to show you what it looks like. So I know my 5 and 6 are going to stay the same, but because this is a 9 and we're adding 1 to it, okay, we're actually going to add, that's become 10, this has become a 0, and this is going to become 5 because we got to add that 1, regroup it over here. So that 4 will be a 5. That 9 is going to be that 0, and then another 0. Okay? Now, we want to make sure that we're going to end in that place value around the hundredths, but this one's unique because we had to borrow. So even though this says the hundredths, these zeros here are still going to drop off, and your final answer will be 56 and 5/10. Because when we round to the decimal places, these decimals have no zeros, and your answer choice is always going to show you that without those zeros there. Okay, so don't let that confuse you. This was an exception to the rule. Okay, all right, so let's look at number 7. So we're going to round 15 and 268 thousandths to the nearest hundredths place. Again, nearest hundredths place means round to the hundredths, not to the tenths, not to the thousands, not whichever one you pick. That would be confusing. We're rounding to the hundredths. So we're going to write 15 and 268 thousandths. We're going to underline that place value that's in the hundredths, which is the second place value to the right of the decimal. I'm going to look next door. I see 8. 8 is 5 or more, so we're going to add 1 more to this 6. So when we come over here and write it, we're going to write 1, 5, and 2. And then the change we're going to make this time is add 1 more to that 6. So 6 plus 1 will give me 7, and then that'll be our 0 where that 8 is. And then we're going to check rounding in the hundredths place. So we're just going to drop that 0 off, and that is our final answer, 15 and 27 hundredths. All right. So now you get to go and try this on your practice. Good luck, and till tomorrow.